5 секунд. Да. Прибрав.
Пані та панове, шановні глядачі, мене звати Данило Лубківський, я радий вас вітати від імені Київського безпекового форуму. Після повідомлень про відведення російських військ від наших кордонів могло скластися враження, що загроза минула. Але це не так. Російська загроза мілітарна, політична, гуманітарна, інформаційна має для України постійний характер. Російська окупація частини України триває. Вона не зникла. Постійний характер має російська загроза для Сполучених Штатів і для Заходу. Сполучені Штати швидко відреагували на ескалацію дій Кремля проти України. Ця реакція була переконливим аргументом для Москви. Але як надовго? І що далі? Як захистити Україну від російської агресії, яка буде продовжуватися? Як захистити спільні...
How to protect the shared interests of Ukraine and the West from Russia's continuous threats, and finally how to use the unique potential partnership between Ukraine and the US. It is those issues that we're going to discuss with the participants of today's discussion. Our special guest is George Kent, US Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for European and Eurasian Affairs. Thank you very much, George, for being with us. Ms. Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, Chairwoman of Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada Committee on EU Integration, Ambassador Danylo, Distinguished Fellow of the Atlantic Council, U.S. Assistant of State of for European and Eurasian Affairs, Andriy Hunder, the President of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine, and Mr. Arseniy Yatsenyuk, Prime Minister of Ukraine in 2014 and 16.
I wish to express, on behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum, our gratitude to Mr. George Kent for accepting our invitation. Mr. Kent is a student of Ukraine, meaning that he knows Ukraine very well. And for many years, he has been what I call a member of the Ukrainian School of United States Diplomacy. I wish to use this opportunity to acknowledge his remarkably strong stance to protect the United States-Ukraine relationship, bilateral relations, against the notorious attempts to corrupt our partnership in the recent years. George, we remember this and we appreciate this. George, I will start from the question which goes immediately to you. In April, Ukraine experienced one of the most dangerous escalations of Russia's aggression. President Putin amassed something bigger than 100,000 troops on our borders. He showed that he could easily amass an additional political pressure on Ukraine and the West. Such a tool is limited in its effectiveness, but this does not make it less dangerous. So, in this context, how do you assess the current American-Ukrainian relations in the context of the latest security escalation on our borders? And what security priorities were agreed by our presidents in their recent telephone conversation? You're welcome.
Thank you very much, Danylo. It's great to be back conversing with old friends and on issues that have been at the core of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, but also issues fundamental to creating a Europe whole, free, and at peace, the generational strategic goal of U.S. foreign policy that my colleague Dan Fried played such an important part over the last 30 years. I would say, first of all, to talk about fundamental interests, that the U.S. wants Ukraine to succeed on its own merits as a country that was born out of the ashes of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, a nation that had a proud history and a culture that was suppressed for centuries. And this is because that is part of our strategic interest, to see the emergence of thriving democracies. And Ukraine has always been seen as a key in this part of Europe. And that is why my former professor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, said if Ukraine were to succeed, that would be a powerful impulse for all of Eastern Slav Orthodox Slavic countries. And on that note, I would just like to wish all of those who celebrate on the Julian calendar a happy Easter season. So I think that is a strategic focus that has and impulse that has been part of our policy for 30 years, as long as I've been in the Foreign Service. It doesn't matter who the U.S. president is. It doesn't matter what party controls which branch of Congress. This is our national interest, and it is a shared interest between Republicans, Democrats, the House of Representatives, the Senate, and those of us who serve in the executive branch. So I think that is critically important to understand. That is where Americans come from when they're looking at Ukraine and wanting to support Ukraine. Now, you raise the issue of security. I know this is the Kyiv Security Forum. Security is about survival, but the U.S. also wants Ukraine to succeed. And that really gets into the reform agenda at home, which I'm sure we'll talk about later. So, but I do want to emphasize that there are two sides of that coin, and that also goes to the nature of the first conversation between our two presidents recently, because while the signal is necessary to reassure Ukraine that we are supportive, the challenges that Ukraine faces is not just to be resilient in the face of Russian aggression, but to be successful in reforming the country, to be a prosperous, democratic country with institutions that protect and serve people rather than defending the state. Now, on the issue of what the threat that Russia poses to Ukraine, I think you were right in some of your introductory comments, Danylo. What people were watching was a massive buildup of conventional forces. But Russia has always used many forms of aggression towards Ukraine. That's classic KGB tactics. You can either use the combination of kombinatsiya and maskirovka. You can use the term active measures. These are the types of terms that I think come out of the Russian terminology, which is different than some of the words that we use in the West, like hybrid aggression. But in addition to the conventional buildup and perhaps some, but not all, troops and equipment going back to their original bases, you have other active measures that are equally worrisome. The disinformation campaign coming out of Moscow, whether it was Simonyan with Russia Today or others, the hysteria about the fascist coup is back. The projection, the attacks and accusations against Ukrainians allegedly for taking offensive action when it's actually a reflection of what Russia itself is doing. The squeeze on diesel supplies, both through Russian companies directly and then through the Belarusian refinery at Mazir, which unexpectedly is doing its fall updates in the spring, so it squeezes the diesel supply at the height of the planting season in Ukraine. The Titushki that show up in Kharkiv, for what purpose? What sort of agents of chaos are the Russians looking and their proxies looking to put into play inside Ukraine? The blocking off of the Black Sea, whether that's just military ships or is the intent to squeeze commercial shipping into Mariupol to raise insurance rates and raise the costs of Ukraine doing business. So I think this is the whole spectrum of Russian aggression towards Ukraine. And of course, I should also, of course, mention cyber attacks, because we know that those are ongoing and continuous. So I think for all of us, Ukrainians and Americans, when we look at the issue of security, we need to define it broadly. And when we talk about Russian aggression, it's not just counting paratroopers, tanks, artillery, and planes, but understanding the broader intent of Russia to undermine the success of Ukraine. Over to you, Danylo.
Thank you, George. If I may, I would like to elaborate on this a little. Definitely the audience of the Kyiv Security Forum would be interested to hear some practical steps. And among them, please answer, what is the likelihood, and this question is quite interesting for many Ukrainian experts and for the overall Ukrainian audience, what is the likelihood of Ukraine getting non-NATO ally status from the United States, which could unlock further US defense support? And can Ukraine expect more defense support beyond the annual 125 million?
In the last several years, the total amount of security assistance that the U.S. Congress has generously appropriated is actually approaching or exceeding 400 million. And the number that you cited is, I think, the total in the State Department budget, what's known as foreign military financing. But for 5 years now, there's also been an increasing pot of money called the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative in the U.S. defense budget. So if you add all the forms of assistance, it actually is now approaching $400 million a year and has been about $2.5 billion since 2014. So that is a tremendous amount of assistance that goes for a variety of items that help the Ukrainian military fight back in the Donbass. We're now focusing on helping rebuild the Navy and maritime coastal domain awareness so that Ukraine can defend its coastal waters. And it also helps support the training that goes on at Yavoriv and elsewhere. So it's something that is worked together bilaterally. We have a bilateral commission between Ukrainian, U.S., and other allies who are engaged in supporting in the security sector. So I would say that it's probably the numbers are and the breadth of the assistance is perhaps larger than many people are aware. And that support will continue. And it goes back to what I mentioned before. It's not just the issue of who is president or which party controls the administration. There is bipartisan support, and our budgets are passed in Congress. And so bipartisan support in Congress is really the bedrock for that security assistance that has come to Ukraine in ever larger amounts in the last 7 years. Oh, and I didn't answer your question. So on the first part of the question on major non-NATO ally status, I think the issue is that was a mechanism created for countries that had no interest and intent of ever joining NATO, in part because they were not near Europe or the North Atlantic Alliance. So it started in the 1970s for countries like Taiwan and Israel, and then it's been expanded since. I think Ukraine has a path forward. It has a commitment made in Bucharest in 2008 that it would eventually become a member of NATO, and it actually has an annual national plan. And that is the mechanism that is the most detailed roadmap to membership. When the Membership Action Plan was created for Poland and other countries in the late 90s, that was to get it to the point of having an annual national plan, which is actually deeper and more specific. And so Ukraine and Georgia both have annual national plans, and that gets into the agenda of reform, because it's not a matter of whether Ukraine's military is inoperable and can fight with alongside NATO armies in places like Afghanistan. Is Ukraine as a country, is its institutions, not just military institutions, do they meet the values and principles of a community of democratic countries with firm civilian control over the military, a reformed intelligence service, a justice sector that delivers justice for all? So this is the agenda, and these are the sorts of things that the annual national plan will help make Ukraine be a successful country, and also will drive it on the road to NATO membership.
Thank you, George. Thank you for this interesting beginning. And now I turn to Mr. Yatsenyuk. Mr. Yatsenyuk, what's your take of how our bilateral partnership with the United States can move forward, and what immediate priorities would you suggest in face of Russia's increased aggression? You're welcome.
Well, going back to your previous question, and George provided an amazing answer, I believe that the best answer is not a kind of vague status for Ukraine, but the best one is to have a NATO membership action plan for Ukraine. And under President Biden, I believe that we have a historic moment to get this membership action plan in order to join NATO. United States is a real strategic ally of Ukraine, and in these very challenging and dramatic times, we actually figure out who is a friend and who is foe. No doubt that foe is the Russian Federation, but real friend and real partner and real ally is the United States of America. And let me remind you, and I'm not sure whether the Ukrainian audience are well aware with these numbers, but Mr. Secretary and the U.S. Embassy already disclosed the numbers. It's around $4 billion that the American people and U.S. governments afforded to support Ukraine in our fight against the Russian enemies and in our fight against corruption and in our fight for our independence. So I really commend President Biden and new administration in making a very bold and strong action in calling to President Putin and actually deterring Putin against the aggression against Ukraine. Because you saw that a few weeks ago, Russian president decided to mess up and to build up its military presence on the Ukrainian borders. It wasn't just a saber rattling. It was a real danger and threat that Putin is to decide to launch a large-scale operation. And the President of the United States did his best in order to stop this. In current circumstances, United States is back on the global stage, back in terms of framing the global policy and supporting and protecting the global democracy. And in these challenging times, it's important that our European allies is to join ranks with the United States in order to stop the Russian aggression, in order to defend the free world, and in order to support Ukraine. To support Ukraine in a number of issues, starting with the supply of lethal and non-lethal weapons and ending with the ramp up of sanctions against the Russian Federation in case if Russia goes further with their menace and belligerent behavior. So it's crystal clear that Ukraine and the US are together, and together we are stronger, and together we will succeed.
And now I turn to Ambassador Danylo Fried, and I would like to thank Your Excellency for being with us today. Great honor and pleasure for the Kyiv Security Forum. Ambassador Fried, what we discuss right now is, I would say, this is Ukraine's strategy in principle and in general. So what kind of Ukraine strategy would you recommend for President Biden administration? You're welcome. Would you be so kind to switch on the mic?
First, it's a pleasure to be here. Дуже дякую. Second, I would just like to state that the United States is lucky to have George Kent as the lead person on Ukraine policy because he knows so much and it's all in his head. He wasn't reading talking points. He understands these issues deeply. Moreover, in the Biden administration, and George, you may want not listen to what I'm about to say, in the Biden administration, he will have the full backing of his chain of command up to and including the Oval Office. The team that the Biden administration is assembling to work on Europe and Russia, Karen Dunfried is nominated to be Assistant Secretary, Toria Nuland, the Undersecretary, Tony Blinken, who knows these issues and has worked on them since the 1990s. This is a good team. This is important. So it is not as if the Biden administration regards Ukraine as some strange exotic country that is best left to the Kremlin. There are such Americans. I'm unhappy to acknowledge, but they're not in the Biden administration. So this is one, this is good. Two, George said it right. There are two threats to Ukraine's future. The external threat from the Kremlin, which has includes both the threat of direct aggression, as we saw in recent weeks with the Russian military buildup against Ukraine, and has an internal dimension, that is subversion, corruption, bribery, disinformation, buying oligarchs, using oligarchs. Those are two vectors of Kremlin pressure. But in addition, there is the internal challenge, which has a limited relationship to the Kremlin. That is the challenge of Ukraine's internal transformation. The Ukrainians have worked at for years. Ukrainian people, when they get a vote, seem to vote for transformation of the country along, these are my words, European lines, or democracy, which Ukraine already has, the rule of law, which it doesn't quite have, and on the basis of that, prosperity. The free market based on the rule of law and buttressed by democracy. George put it well, and Zbig Brzezinski also was my professor many years ago. Exactly right. A Europeanizing Ukraine, by which I mean a Ukraine which is following more or less the path pioneered by the Baltic states and Poland a generation ago of internal transformation, is going to be good for Russia, but very bad for Putinism. It will be good for Russia because it will show Russians that there is an alternative. And you need no American to tell you this, you know it. Prime Minister Yatsenyuk has told me this, that Ukrainians know this. Both challenges are critical. The Biden administration has a deep knowledge of Ukraine, including President Biden. I'm glad that the Biden administration responded in a coherent and determined fashion to warn Putin away from military aggression. They handled that rather skillfully. But the challenge is going to be long-term. Putin won't stop. He will find other methods. But the challenge is also Ukraine's. Ukrainian patriots have defended the country from external Russian aggression since 2014. And that has given Ukrainians time to make the country work. And security will also begin at home. If Ukraine becomes more prosperous, if the rule of law is stronger, if the iron ring of oligarchic control over so many sectors of the Ukrainian media and economy is broken in favor not of government control or just some other oligarchs, but in favor of the rule of law, Ukraine's prospects will brighten. Another thing that George said is right. Republicans and Democrats support Ukraine. There is an isolationist wing on the far left and an isolationist wing on the far right. The one on the far right is the more dangerous at the moment, but they are not in control. They are not in control. The Congress still, Republicans and Democrats, supports Ukraine. This is an opportunity. Moreover, it's not just the United States. Angela Merkel's call to Putin was also important. When she warned him to back off the military threats, this was important. The Biden administration has laid out a coherent Russia policy. They've sketched it out. More needs to be filled in. But that policy does not start with doing a deal with the Kremlin over the heads of the Ukrainians. That's not the deal. The deal is we will work with Russia where we can, but on the basis of truth and while we are pushing back with strength against Russian aggression. That is a sustainable policy. I'm glad to be here. I'm happy to answer any questions. Oh yeah, one more thing. Yes, when the Russian military threat to Ukraine seemed to be at its height, I wrote about sanctions options that we could put in place if the Russians moved. And I did that because I was sick to death of some Americans who say we use sanctions too much and we have no more sanctions options for the Russians. We do. We have a lot of options. And I just wanted to lay it out.
Excellency, I thank you very much. And we will talk about the sanction policy a little bit later. And I thank you very much for your reply. And now I turn to Ivanna Klympush-Tsintsadze, the chair of the EU committee in the Ukrainian parliament. I thank you, Ivanka, for being with us today. So, you know, what we discuss is, it sounds like Ukraine enjoys a favorable environment in the United States. So my question to you is that what security, 1, 2, 3 priorities would you request on the Ukraine-US agenda? You're welcome.
Well, thank you very much, and I'm absolutely thrilled to join this great company of friends in speaking about our further bilateral agenda. So from my perspective, I'd probably echo something that was already said. Obviously, Ukraine has to use in full this window of opportunity when we have the administration in the US that really has this incredibly deep understanding of the country and is interested in the country's success. So therefore, I'd expect that the US would resume its leadership within NATO, for example, in terms of adding the pro-map for Ukraine and Georgia countries to the cohort of those who are ready to consider this in the nearest time. Meanwhile, understanding that yes, even though this major status of ally beyond NATO was created not necessarily for those who have the ambitions to join NATO, have the prospect of joining NATO, but maybe while a map is still being brewed, we can enjoy the support of Congress, where we do have the bipartisan support, and have through this mechanism additional military, additional economic, additional financial support from the U.S. in order for Ukraine to be both secure and successful. Obviously, I also share the view that the U.S. sanction policy should not be only continued, but in case Russia does not change its behavior, it should be actually further enhanced, both in the sectoral way and against people from the families of those who are taking, from the decision makers that are taking decisions against the freedom, sovereignty, territorial integrity, and sovereignty of Ukraine. And last but not least, I think also within the security realm, it's extremely important that the U.S. continues its support, motivation, and if you want, push for Ukraine's reform agenda. And I am lacking right now the open and clear and sometimes not very pleasant even dialogue between the United States and Ukraine. But when we were very frankly laying out the problems that have to be addressed in order to actually be closer to European community, to Euro-Atlantic community, in order to actually follow the choice of the Ukrainian people of 2014 and the choice that Ukrainian people have been defending since the start of the Russian aggression. So more real actions. I would expect that the U.S. would push Ukraine for more real actions, not just declarations on the way of reforms and changes for the benefit of the citizens of our country and for the benefit and security of the Western civilization to which Ukraine does belong.
I thank you very much, Ivanka, and I'm immediately getting back to George Kemp. George, are you with us? I have a couple of questions for you, we have plenty of them here. George, definitely we will discuss the reform agenda at the end of our discussion, but in the middle, I would like to devote this space for Russia. And for our audience, it would be quite interesting to learn more about the U.S. vision of its relationship with President Putin, with the Kremlin, with Russia, with this regime. How does the President Biden administration plan to develop its relations with Putin? And also here, this is a very important part. I would like you to make a special focus on it. How do you see the United States' involvement in the international efforts, negotiations to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity, both on Crimea and Donbas tracts? You're welcome.
Thank you, Danylo. I think President Biden made clear in his first expectation-setting conversation with the Russian president in January that the U.S. would hold Russia to account for its past actions. And the package of measures that were announced on April 15th included actions to hold Russia to account. That included Russia's election interference in U.S. election cycles. And as I think people are well aware, some of that was run through Ukrainian citizens through disinformation campaigns. It had to do with solar winds and cyber hacking. I mentioned Russia attacks against Ukraine. The cyber attacks against the United States have been certainly intense. There was also a component of targeting of Russian soldiers, American servicemen in Afghanistan. And then there was also a component on the building of the bridge across the Kerch Strait into Crimea. And I think as part of the messaging, the United States made clear that there were additional measures that could be taken were Russian malign action to continue. And so I think that is particularly, and you can have dialogue with Dan Fried, our former sanctions coordinator, about that. But the initial announcement that we were going to sanction initial issuances of Russian new debt in rubles, effective in June, is a strong signal of what could happen were the malign actions to continue. And I think this is the critical signaling part, and where it affects or involves potentially any additional Russian actions against Ukraine, because the steps taken this spring were for past Russian actions. Russia was not held to account, as has often been the case, for their past transgressions. So the actions that were taken this month had to do with accounting for past actions. But the signal intended as a deterrent is that if Russian malign actions were to continue, there could be additional sanctioning of Russian debt, secondary holdings of both ruble and U.S. dollar-denominated debt, which would devastate the actual value of those holdings because it would reduce the market. And then the biggest step could be sanctioning holding that debt, which would then lead U.S. Financial institutions to sell it and basically dump it onto the market and again crash the value. So that's not an idle threat. We have the authorities to use it if Russian behavior warrants. Now, that's the incentive to behave. The reality is that there are issues about which the United States and Russia, Washington and Moscow, regardless of the countries or the leaders and the time, need to talk for the sake of our two countries in the world. And I think arms control is clearly an area where it's in everybody's interest. It's Moscow's interest, the United States' interest, the interest of the world, that the U.S. and Russia have a mature conversation and agree on the rules of the road that lower the security threat to our countries and to other countries as well. So I think that always has formed, going back to détente and the conversations that happened under President Nixon in the early 1970s and through varying administrations and leaders of the Soviet Union and Russia, that is an issue and a constant that is worth having American and Russian officials talk. There obviously are other issues, nuclear non-proliferation if it comes to North Korea, Iran, and other issues where, again, there is could be common ground. And then the problems start, whether it's the bilateral direct challenges or issues like Ukraine. I think the United States has been steadfast and clear about our firm, unyielding support for Ukraine's territorial integrity and sovereignty. The last administration issued the so-called Crimea Declaration in July of 2018. Crimea is Ukraine. That was consciously molded on what was known as the Wells Declaration in 1940. We did not accept the Soviet incorporation of the Baltic states. And in a practical term, even though there were some Baltic diplomats that were in the United States from 1939 until 1991, Russia, the Soviet Union, controlled those three countries. But we did not formally recognize it, and we embraced their reemergence as independent free countries in 1991. And we will not accept the Russian illegal annexation, occupation of Crimea. We welcome the Crimea Platform initiative of the Ukrainian government, and we look forward to working with diplomatic partners to keep that issue on the international agenda. How the United States and international partners can help Ukraine seek to reclaim its sovereignty and resolve the challenge of something like the war in the Donbass is a vexing problem. It's what our war colleges call a wicked problem. Not that it's evil, but it's just wicked difficult. That's sort of Bostonian English, wicked hard. And this is a challenge that I and my colleagues face in looking at other conflicts caused by Russia, whether it's the Transnistrian conflict next door in Moldova, which also is a form of instability that affects Ukraine, Abkhazia and South Ossetia and Georgia, and now Nagorno-Karabakh between Armenia and Azerbaijan, but has Russian peacekeepers for the first time in that part of the South Caucasus since the breakup of the Soviet Union. And so the challenge in all of these cases is how can any country and collection of countries try to change Russia's cost calculus and its behavior. And I will say that that is a very difficult challenge. It is not easy, and no one has come up with a winning solution. So I think we have to work closely as partners, coordinate our positions, keep the pressure up, seek incentives for good behavior, who don't reward bad behavior. And then basically there are other factors that can be controlled, and that includes then going back to the reform agenda to make sure that Ukraine succeeds and is a magnet for those Ukrainians in occupation who understand if there's a choice, there is no choice. Living in a free, independent, successful Ukraine is far better than living under the Russian yoke.
Thank you, George. Ivanko, I'm getting back to you. I have two questions for you. The first question is, which is related to what George said right now, but is is very important and is very important for Ukraine. What do you think about President Zelensky's idea to have a bilateral talk with President Putin? This is my first question. And the second question is, what do you expect from the U.S. administration in its talks with Putin and Russia? You're welcome.
Well, thank you. What do I think about the initiative to have a bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Mr. Putin? I'm worried, and to put it very mild, very much. Because my take is that unfortunately President Zelensky at this particular moment does not really have a clear answer for himself what exactly he expects from this particular meeting. And from that point of view, it seems that the Ukrainian president in this particular area is still trying to play president rather than be a president. So I suppose for many people who are analyzing this initiative, this is worrisome for those who are actually interested in Ukraine's success and in Ukraine's restoring of its territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence, not at the expense of additional compromises from Ukraine. Also, we have to remember that even pressure and presence of the other Western partners at the table within the Normandy format meeting with Putin did not really ensure that Putin has delivered upon his promises or the decisions that have been taken even in this wider format. Something that was very important after these meetings is that at least it always uncovered the truth and precluded Russia from additional manipulations and lies in terms of the decisions that have been reached there at these meetings. So my take is that Moscow does not really plan to agree with someone or somebody, especially with Ukraine directly, bilaterally, and is not ready to lend an ear to listen to Ukraine's desire or Ukraine's vision for the solution, how to stop the Russian aggression against Ukraine. So therefore, unfortunately, I think that this initiative is just yet another kind of PR action that is not going to be beneficial for Ukraine, and I am afraid that Putin can use this to his benefit and to benefit of Kremlin, not necessarily the Russian people. With regard to your other question, Danylo, what do I expect from direct contact between the U.S. and Russian Federation? Well, first and foremost, I'd really like to cherish the refreshment and kind of coming back of the U.S. as a world leader in defending democracy, human rights, freedoms, and a rule of law and international law. And therefore, I think very important that in this direct context, and the agenda might be extremely exhaustive and actually very difficult for those direct contacts, there won't be any trade off at the expense of Ukraine. There won't be anything that would would trade the values for the benefit of tactical solutions, for the benefit of reaching some technical goals or business interests, or even some of the long-lasting interests of the United States. And obviously, I am very much interested that the Russian Federation, if it doesn't change their behavior, its behavior it should be actually punished. And I think that that's a strong message should be coming from the U.S. So I would like to see that this balance of this communication being pointed at the need of Russia to finally be abided by the international law and stop telling rude lies, if I may say so, to the whole international community, as it has been doing up to date and violating international law. Even the Soviet Union, besides maybe Afghanistan, didn't allow itself to behave that way as Russia does lately. So it should be stopped.
Thank you, Ivanka. And I'm getting back to Ambassador Fried. Moscow will try what Ivanka has said, what George is saying. Moscow will try to outplay us. Moscow will try to counter the policies of the West and the Ukraine. For many years, you've been the United States coordinator for sanctions policy, and you know how to deter Russia. You know it. In your opinion, what kind of sanctions perspective can make Russia stop its direct aggression towards Ukraine? This question is closely related to what George Kent said. You're welcome.
Sanctions are not a magic bullet. Sanctions alone will not convince Putin to back off Ukraine. They can affect his calculation. He is like any Soviet-trained person, alert to the costs and benefits of a given course of action. He will analyze them carefully. The possibility of sanctions will enter into his calculation. It can affect it. Whether or not the West is united in sanctions or whether the United States is isolated in sanctions is another important factor for him to consider. There are escalatory options available to us. How we use them has to be linked to an overall strategy on Ukraine. How does the Biden administration intend to intensify its diplomacy in support of the solution on the Donbass, independently of the Minsk group or the Normandy format, with it, both? These are issues that George Kent and others will be working through. Sanctions can play a role, particularly the possibility of escalatory steps. But as I said, they are not the sole factor. And a footnote, sanctions are not the only tool of economic statecraft. Going after corrupt flows of Russian money and enforcing increasing transparency for high-end real estate deals, limited liability corporations, art investment, and other methods that the Russians have used to launder their money is important. That is, those are not sanctions. They are in addition to sanctions. So there are a set of tools. But I have one more perspective. You said that Putin will try to use his tactical nimbleness to outsmart the West, to go around us, to confuse us. And you have a point. And I remember these arguments from the late 1970s and the 1980s. The Soviets often had a tactical advantage in their their flexibility and able to do take various malign actions. However, where's the Soviet Union today?
Good point.
We thought we were losing the Cold War through the mid-1980s. I would rather have our problems than Putin's. I would rather have our problems than Putin's. His economy is stagnant. The future of Russian exports, energy, fossil fuel energy, does not look glorious. The ability of Russia to develop new industries to modernize its economy is limited. It begins to look like the period of vremya zastoya, the period of stagnation, both political and economic, because Putin does not appear to have the capacity or the interest in serious reform. Now, that means that tactically we are going to be at a disadvantage, but not strategically. Not strategically. Trump had faith in autocracy. He preferred it. We must renew our faith in democracy, and Biden seems determined to do that. So, let's remember our deeper strengths and then work to bolster them. Anyway, that's a larger thought, but you asked the question.
Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador. I like your points. We will win this war strategically, because this war was started by Russia, but we will win this war. I'm getting to George Kent, and George, finally, I start this final part of our discussion, which would be related to reforms and anti-corruption agenda, and I thank Andy Hunder for his patience, and I will invite him to join our conversation. George, here I have a number of questions. First, we remember that as we mentioned before, President Biden called President Zelensky. They had a number of important points raised during the conversation, and among them, and among those points, definitely President Biden raised matters related to Ukraine's reform and anti-corruption agenda. What was the most important message, and what do you think? Was President Biden satisfied with what he heard from his Ukrainian colleague? And here, let me add one additional point. Yesterday, it was announced in the media, not by the official sources, that Ukraine can expect the visit of Secretary Blinken to Kyiv. So is it true? Can you confirm it? And would you raise these issues if this trip will happen? You're welcome.
Thank you, Danylo. I realize I think we may be taping for future broadcasts, so I'm not sure precisely when this session will be posted live. I think U.S. travel to the region will become clear in the coming days. I would say that Ukrainians who are aware of the contents of the call between our two presidents earlier this month understand that the vast majority of the conversation was about the reform agenda. The reassurance message is relatively simple. The reform challenges that Ukraine face currently are broad and deep. And my understanding is that the conversation was just what you would expect, led by someone like President Biden, who has spent so many years and so much time in Ukraine and working with Ukrainians to help reform the country. So I think the criticality of the justice sector, the broad justice sector, was a core part of the conversation. They talked about NABU, SOP, the High Council of Justices, the need to have a clean judiciary with integrity, how to select judges and members of the High Council of Judges, and what do you do when judges are on the take and not delivering justice either for Ukrainian citizens or foreign investors. That is absolutely critical for Ukraine's success, as it is for the success of any country that is still trying to escape the post-Soviet heritage. That's the same conversation we have with Georgians, and it will continue, both driven by the demands of Ukrainian citizens and the expectation of Ukrainian partners. It also is broader, and this is perhaps a good segue into Andy, and I'm not talking about phone calls now, I'm talking about the challenges that Ukraine faces. Corporate governance is absolutely essential, and it is essential because the private sector and large state-owned enterprises that need to be run on a sustainable basis must have both independence and integrity in the selection of the key executives and independent supervisory boards, as well as the decisions that they make, not in their personal own interests, but in the interests of their, if you will, their stockholders, which are the Ukrainian people. And so whether we're talking about big banking sector institutions like Privat Bank or Ashad Bank, whether we're talking about key energy players, whether it's Energoatom or Naftahaz, having clean, competent, transparent leadership that is selected transparently is absolutely essential, not only for the success of those companies, but for the success of strategic sectors in Ukraine. And I believe by the time the session is broadcast, Ukraine will be talking about changes at Naftogaz. And I think the issue of corporate governance has been part of the conversation over the past 5 years, as much as conversations about anti-corruption institutions like NABU and SAP. And so it has been a principle that the IMF has talked about for conditionality of programming. It is processes that we have been intimately involved in, helping providing advice, expert advice on transparency of selection. In the end, it's not about the person. It's about the institution and the procedures. And the goal is to have institutions with integrity and transparent mechanisms for both selection and dismissal. And when those established procedures and law and regulation are violated because there are people who want to be controlling, whether it is the cash flows or the institutions and the people, that does not serve Ukraine's interests. And it does weaken the commitment to work together for a successful country. So I think this challenge, this set of challenges, whether it's in the justice sector, which includes the law enforcement, prosecutorial, and judicial elements, or whether it's in the corporate governance sector, it's a combination of anti-corruption, integrity, and transparency. Over to Andy.
Andy, and I thank you, George. Andy, I will continue with my questions to you. Andy Hunder, the president of the American Chamber of Commerce in Ukraine. How do you assess the current business and anti-corruption climate in Ukraine? I just need to mention that we are live, so our audience follows already follows our discussion, and so feel free just to react upon the events that you know have happened, have already happened in Kyiv. So can you please describe your perception of this climate in Ukraine in 1, 2, 3 points, if I may? You're welcome.
Thank you, Danylo. I think George hits the nail on the head. The three major obstacles of doing business in Ukraine today. Number one is the lack of rule of law. Number two is corruption. And number three is a lack of a bold reform agenda. This is data from our brand new latest survey from the American Chamber of Commerce and City. These are the CEOs that are working on the ground here in Ukraine. These are companies, a total of our members have invested $50 billion over the last 3 decades in Ukraine. But still, these are the challenges we face and the members face on a daily basis. And I think, what George focused on is that the rule of law, that is number one. And I think we really need to get this right, and now's the time to do it. The business community, they're putting high hopes on the Biden presidency. Why? Because I don't think in the history of the US has a president of the United States known Ukraine as well as President Biden does. A fantastic team in DC, a fantastic team here in Kyiv. So, the business community is optimistic that now is really this chance to help and push through, this reform agenda. I think, we have seen a slowdown. Some would say a rollback to what we had a number of years ago, including when Arseniy and Ivanna were in government. I think, we are lacking champions. That those Ukrainians that are really passionate and are going into government for the right reasons to introduce the changes that the country so much needs. And that's what the business community wants. We are seeing that businesses are looking at Ukraine. We see travel between the US and Ukraine. Tomorrow morning, we've got more people coming in, flying in. They want to know what's going on in the country. I think that there are still so many opportunities. There are many great success stories that we have. Out of our 600 members that have believed in Ukraine. But in order for Ukraine to really to thrive and to grow further, it's getting the rule of law and this reform agenda back on track. And we are hopeful that, with the support from across, from the US and, having a bit of a stick, I think it is necessary, really to have a wake-up call that now is the time to do it. And I think, we're in this together. And hopefully we'll see some real results very soon.
Good. I thank you, Andy, for your answer, and I thank you all for all your remarks that you said today at the Kyiv Security Forum online event. And I invite Mr. Yatsenyuk to make his input into our conversation. Mr. Yatsenyuk, what do you think, just summing up what was discussed, in your opinion, is the West ready to stand up to Putin's challenges? And are President Zelensky, in your opinion, and the Ukrainian authorities ready to stand up to the security and reform challenges of the future days? You're welcome.
Well, as I already mentioned, well, it's crystal clear that the United States is back on the global stage. And the US is a flagship in fighting for democracy and for the free world. It's important to have our European friends on board. It's of crucial importance to have one united Europe together with United States as a big Euro-Atlantic community who is standing against the Russian aggression, because for all of us it's clear that Russia poses a threat to our people, to our security and to our nations. I have no doubt that the United States will support Ukraine and Ukrainian people. They showed it, they are doing it, and they will continue to make it. But I have some doubts about whether Ukraine, I mean the Ukrainian government, is ready to get this kind of support. Because the political will to execute reform is very important right now. What is the key pillars or the most important issues which are on the reform agenda? Rule of law. A sweeping justice reform is needed. A vibrant economy and market-based reforms, not a kind of new Bolsheviks, which I smell in the air. An energy reform, and the CEO of Naftogaz has been just sacked. So I believe that the government and the president will not sack the energy reform and energy independence, and will not restart the import of the Russian gas from the Russian Gazprom. To eradicate corruption in the government, to eradicate corruption in the state-owned enterprises, because tycoons and oligarchs exist only in the corrupted society and corrupted government. And this is the best way how to answer all these challenges we are facing right now. So on the side of our Western partners, West and the United States are interested in having Ukraine as a success story. And it's a constitutional obligation of the Ukrainian government and Ukrainian president to make this real.
Thank you, Mr. Yatsenyuk. And actually, we are almost at the end of our conversation, and I would like to thank you very much for your interesting contributions and great remarks. And now I address the audience of Kyiv Security Forum. Пані та панове, це була цікава розмова про суть і унікальні шанси українського партнерства. Ця розмова дуже потрібна сьогодні для України, для нашого розуміння, що відбувається в світі і як світ ставиться до України. А нам потрібне всім разом...
And all of us, we need to have the sense of peace, tranquility and security in such days, pre-Easter days. So we would like to wish you all very good, healthy and calm and safe Easter, so that we can win over COVID, Russian aggression and any other challenges that we may have. We all face fantastic future. Дякуємо всім, що ви були з нами. Thank you for your attention.